And now, it's time for some fireside to discuss why digital rights matter. And with that, we'd like to call on Malik Khan Katadia from Global Impact FinTech Forum and Yat Siu from Animoca Brands.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Well, I know it's crypto winter, but some more energy. Good afternoon. It's not every day that we get to have a fireside chat with someone like Yat, who's both a pioneer and someone who's robust enough in this space, given what's happening. And we'll cover a lot of topics today. So I discussed with Yat, and we're going to skip the introductions. Anybody who wants to know more about him or needs to know more about him can check out his profile on LinkedIn. Let's jump straight to the meat of the discussion because we have limited time and I want to make the best use of it. Yet you have been known as a very passionate proponent of digital rights. And I think, despite, I'm sure, most of the folks here being well-versed with this space, I would like your very personal and clear articulation on how you see digital rights, because there still seems to be some sort of if not ambiguity, different perspectives. Some people believe digital rights in terms of gaming rights for those who game, and we heard speakers earlier from yield, etc. All of those nice things that you've invested in. Some people talk about security tokens. Some people talk about securitized tokens, real-world assets getting securitized, and that's a digital right of a real physical thing. In your view, how would you define it in very simple layman terms for our audience?
Sure. I think we can start with a very simple foundation. I can sort of lean off a quote from George Washington, of course, the first president of the US. He basically, what he said is that freedom and property rights are intertwined. You can't have one without the other. And the same is true for digital property rights. You can't have digital freedom unless you have digital property rights. The foundation of this is ownership. So when you think about places like the Philippines, obviously Axie is like the hit Web3 game here. The paradigm that made Axie powerful wasn't play to earn. Play to earn obviously was something that now play and earn sort of obviously was built here, but it came from ownership first. It was the ownership of the Axies that allowed someone like YGG to come and create a business on top of that ownership. And when you think of our history in the physical term, everything we do, whether it's car ownership, house ownership, shoe ownership, fashion ownership in the physical world, there are industries that surround and grow from that because of we can do business with a person who has that ownership. Meaning you have the true freedom to interact, to transact, and to own, and to do whatever you wish to. And that's what the digital world doesn't have. So that's the foundation. And I think to close on this topic, every country in the world, because after all, what you're all building here is virtual economies, which is basically like real economies. Every country that has low property rights, North Korea, some places in South America, and other sort of very, very sort of problematic places, have very low GDPs, very low incomes, because you can't build on something that could disappear tomorrow, that you don't have ownership. All the countries that have strong property rights, whether this is in the US or in Europe or Hong Kong or Singapore, have very strong GDPs, and that's not a coincidence. So if you translate the property rights ownership paradigm from the digital world, which is our equity, into the digital world, we're not only just going to create more equity in the world, we're also going to create an incredible amount of new sort of capital formation, right? And you can see this already in the form where it's not a 10 or 20% change, it's a 20 to 30x change because of the fact that you can now, give a loan to someone, or, have a rental product, or have a yield generation product on top of someone's ownership.
Thank you, and that's interesting. You started with George Washington, and then you connected digital property rights to the GDPs of countries. So I think from gaming to the macro perspective, that's a great segue into the next thing that I wanted your perspectives on, which is Web 3.0. And I think, again, Web 3.0 is perhaps one of the most used/abused jargons around these days, and also something on which different people may have different perspectives. But very broadly speaking, we say Web 1.0 was about the static web, and when the internet was born about 30 years ago, then during the 99-2000 dot-com winter, when dot-com became a dirty word, and I was very much there. I was one of those failed entrepreneurs myself then. We saw from the ashes, the phoenix rise, and the birth of Web 2.0, and suddenly platform economics and platform economies became such a big thing. For those of you who may not know, one of my hats is I'm also a professor of fintech, so I teach fintech to MBA students, and I usually try and go back in history to give them a perspective of how we could perhaps look at how Web 3.0 will evolve, because there are always clues in history. It may not, repeat, but it certainly rhymes. But the problem with the platform economies was we saw the rise of monopolies, walled gardens, and I just wanted to do a quick thing, Yat. I think this will prove the point. I will just ask all those in the audience who have used either Facebook or Instagram in the last 1 week to raise their hands. Pretty much 80 to 90%. And yet, how many of you get compensated for it, forget having a stake in it? So I think that growth of the platform economy and how it again was the next driver of that 20 to 30x kind of a thing is apparent. But there's also one statistic I would like to share before I hear from Yat, is that some of you may be aware that in 2021, about a year and a half back, Apple made some changes to its iOS policy, and there was a time when Facebook was around $1 trillion company. Today is less than a quarter of that. So clearly the fact that your data has power, and not just power in an ethereal sense of, it's my data sovereignty and ownership, but real market value, it can wipe out trillions, is what the market is signaling to us. Web 3.0 is supposed to be the harbinger of the ownership economy. Yeah, tell us, I know you were one of those early advocates, proponents, pioneers of this, but do you believe these existing Web 2.0 giants are going to go down quietly into the night, the Tencents, the Facebooks, and their 1 billion plus users, Facebook perhaps 3 billion user walled gardens? What's your very objective view about this?
Well, change or die is what I think. But I think, so just to sort of riff a little bit on that, one of the things that is valuable about data isn't the data in and of itself, because that's raw materials. What makes data valuable is a derivative output from it, right? Because through our data, they learn things that we can't figure out ourselves. And it's a little bit like finding oil. If you found oil 500 years ago in your backyard, it'd just be a dirty sludge. But today, we have the machinery to make valuable energy out of oil. And that's the same for data. Because of AI and because of machine learning, we can take the data of billions of people and create things like, self-driving cars or automated analysis, or maybe even know things about us that we don't know about ourselves. So the problem is that that value chain isn't translated down to us. And that's the point about Web3. That's not to say that it has to be valuable. It's to say that we finally know what the value actually is. And because we have an ownership, we can then go and have intermediaries come in and say, well, maybe I can give you something better for that service. Like many of you here in this room are probably worth tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to Facebook in some form or fashion. You just don't know that, but you are valuable to them. If you knew that you were worth $100,000 to Facebook a year, the natural response would be to go to Facebook and say, well, you should pay me a share of that. But if Facebook doesn't pay you that share, what will happen is someone else will go and say, oh, I know you're a really valuable person to Facebook. I'll pay you something to use my platform instead. Now, we do this in imperfect ways. We go to influencers, and we try to count their followers, and we try to understand how popular they are, and then we do an ad deal with them, or we try to do some kind of transaction, because through these imperfect measures, we try to analyze what the worth might be. But many times, we get it wrong because maybe the followers aren't real, maybe they're not that influential, because we actually don't really know what their value is, because the only one who does know what their value is Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and those guys. They never actually tell us what it is because they don't want us to know, right? And so, this is, I guess, a big focus is on Web3 gaming. So I want to address this on the Web3 gaming side, because a lot of people have talked about gaming and said, oh, this is a Ponzi scheme, where does the value come from? Well, gaming is a $200+ billion industry. This year alone, $110 billion will be spent in app installs. That goes primarily to Apple, Facebook, Google, and a bunch of other guys. Then there's a platform fee, which is another 30%, right? And then you have, and then you have what's left over for game developers and gamers and all that kind of stuff. Which means that something like 70, maybe 80% of what the game industry makes today, an industry bigger than movies and music combined, goes to companies that never put back into the gaming industry. Apple doesn't invest in games. Facebook doesn't give vouchers for gamers. Google doesn't invest in gaming infrastructure or anything like this, right? They don't support basically the gaming industry as a whole. But we don't know that. So the gamer doesn't see it. He doesn't understand that he's already heavily financified and that actually 80% or 70% of his value translates to a platform that only extracts. So what Web3 does is, with blockchain, is opens it up. So now you can say, oh, okay, this gamer is worth $5 or this gamer is worth $10. And through tokenization, imperfect as it may be for the time being, we have a way in which we can judge the value of the perspective of a gamer. And when you give away, for instance, NFTs, we're actually giving advertising dollars out by a user acquisition method. But the thing is, when you give them these NFTs, what actually happens is that the percentage of the people that might reinvest into the game is much larger because as a gamer, you have an incentive to do so. So you're really rewarding the players as opposed to giving all that value to the platform who are there only to extract. Right? And so this is a perfect illustration of how everything in the digital world is already financified, but we just don't see it. And this is very similar to Web 1. In Web 1, we did this with raw materials. The reason why we can buy rice for fair prices or for other kinds of materials is because we can see the farmer in China can see, oh, my rice is being sold for 100x. Well, I want more, right? So we went in Web 1 from the physical commodities and gave rise to companies like E-Trade and Alibaba and Amazon and all those guys, right? That was sort of Web 1. In Web 3, we're doing actually very much the same thing, but we're just doing it through the data paradigm because data is the most valuable resource.
Thank you. So two very important points here, unlocking of value, democratizing of value, and of course, as we keep talking about the participative economy. Yat, again, you are known as one of the both pioneers as well as perhaps articulate proponents of digital economics in the Web 3.0 space. Maybe share a little bit of that with our audience. How do you see the economics of not just play-to-earn gaming, but Web 3 itself evolving, and the role of NFTs in something like that?
Well, I covered some of that already earlier in terms of the value chain, but I think the important thing is that all of you here are building new economies. You're building like mini nations in effect. And so the way that we like to judge the success of these companies is not based on a pure profit and loss statement, but actually, obviously, you need to be sustainable. But we try to look at it in terms of economic activity, and which basically informs the way that we invest. So when we make investments, we don't just look at investing from the perspective of, is the company itself going to be very valuable? We invest from the perspective of what do we think it's going to add to the ecosystem. So does $1 million check create $10 million of economic activity? That's a win in and of itself. And our earliest investments in 2018 and 2019 actually came from that lens. I mean, we were one of the earliest investors in Axie Infinity and in OpenSea and those companies. We were hoping that they would do well, of course. But the investment lens didn't come from that perspective. It came from the perspective of, will it grow the ecosystem? And will it also assist in the growth of what we're building? And if the economic activity rises, then everything else is gravy. It just turned out that in 2021, that part may have accelerated faster than the economic activity, but that's the nature of capital markets, I guess. But generally speaking, that's how we look at it. And I think for everyone here, this is why open is so important. The more open you are, the more interoperable network effects you can have. I mean, imagine if you owned a car, but you were only restricted to use one vendor for the car or two vendors for the car. Well, first of all, your choice of services is limited. The pricing of those services is going to be also monopolized, which means as a consumer, you have less choice, less competition, and we all know that that's a bad outcome. But when it's open to all to interface with, then you have an open market. Which is why the more open your digital assets are, the more free the market becomes, the more competitive, the better for the consumer, and the better for the market because you have competitive pressure, right? So you want, for instance, for your assets to have limitless network effects. You don't want them to have one or two network effects, right? If you own an NFT, is it going to be used by 30 games? Can it be used in a lending platform? Or can it only be used in one game, which is what we have with Web 2 games, for instance? Well, clearly, there's a value difference between the two, for instance, right? So that's why blockchain is so exciting, because true ownership allows this. And now I can work with you simply because you have ownership.
Thank you. I think all of us are aware of the power of network economics thanks to Web 2.0 and the platform economy. Now we are talking about network economics in the Web 3.0 era where ownership takes it to the next level. I know the clock is ticking, they're showing us the timer, but I do want to ask you a couple of questions, and one of them is about the metaverse. You can't have a Web 3.0 conference without talking about the metaverse. Again, you are one of those very passionate advocates of the open metaverse, and your investments speak for themselves. On the other hand, you have the likes of Zuckerberg, who's investing $10 billion a year, and perhaps the entire future of his company, and not just the name, on a closed metaverse. So he's betting it will be an immersive experience for these 3 billion users. And I was just talking to a couple of friends of mine at the Singapore FinTech Festival last week who work with governments. I shall not name them. They believe the metaverse cannot be open. By its very architecture and design, it has to be constructed as a public services. It has to, if not a walled garden, at least there have to be boundary conditions, and then it can become a PPP, a public-private partnership. I know where you stand on this, but tell us why you believe the open metaverse will be the future versus Zuckerberg's vision, or what countries are trying to implement.
So when you go back to the George Washington quote, when you have property rights, you have freedom. So the freedom to transact and the freedom to do with what you want doesn't come from the creator of the assets to decide what it should be. So for instance, who decided that the shoes you're wearing might have different colors? Who decided that cars should have leather seats? Who decided that furniture from IKEA is good or not for your house? The point is that that freedom belongs to the creators who interact with the ownership of third-party assets. Instead of saying, oh, I created this car or this object in this way, and it is destined to be used only in one particular way, which is the Web 2 narrative, right? And so it has to be controlled and managed. But I think the beautiful and disruptive thing about ownership is that, if we didn't have ownership of cars, we wouldn't have Uber, right? We wouldn't have, Lyft, we wouldn't have Grab, and these type of innovations possible because we'd have to seek permission from the platform, for instance, right? So I think the point is that, many creators might have this view that I know what's best for consumers. And, some people may have a good idea of that. But if you open up the wisdom and the capability of millions of people to transact with it, then innovation comes about. Some new idea will emerge that the best person will have never figured out, right? You can't compete with the wisdom of the crowds ultimately at the end of the day, right? And I think that's also one of the reasons why things like democracies are so appealing as well, because there's a way in which we can have an ideation process that can evolve from there.
Thank you. Last question, but certainly not the least, the elephant in the room, and I know some of the previous panels covered this as well. We are in a deep, deep crypto winter, no denying that. And I can say from personal experience, I was there in the thick of the 2000 dot-com crash. As I said, I was a failed entrepreneur, so I have seen one boom-bust cycle. I was there at Citibank when the 2008 global financial crisis happened, and we didn't know on a Friday evening call that we'll have our jobs on Monday or whether the company will exist on Monday. I saw the first crypto winter with many of you here as well, so I'm not immune to these cycles. But there seems to be something, as we've heard, and let's name the name, FTX. A lot of people thought that was one of the more trusted entities, and here we are. Sadly, many people have not just lost their money, but lost their trust. What would your final words be to the community?
So for all of you who have been here longer, you know what I'm talking about. 2018, 2019 was the true crypto winter. If this is the winter, it is colder than it was 6 months ago, but it is certainly not an ice age as how 2018, 2019 was. But there is something sad, of course, which is that in 2018, most people spoke about crypto in the context of scams. So it was really hard for us, for anyone in the NFT industry, because we're like, oh, here's another kind of token, but it is less liquid and you can't trade it. But would you like to invest in the company? So obviously that was a really tough time. When the Terra thing happened, actually more people lost money, which was sad. However, because of the people involved, most of the industry outside were like, well, these didn't seem like the kind of good actors anyway, and we're moving on. So the narrative that crypto was a scam wasn't really there. But what happened most recently with the whole SPF, FTX situation is that because he was so out there and was pushing altruism and everything, for a lot of mom and pops who had no idea about crypto, this became the narrative, right? And I think today we can safely say that, unfortunately, not only was he perpetuating fraud, but I think he's exhibiting sociopathic behavior, and I'll put that on record, because he's not serving our industry in terms of, you make mistakes is one thing, but now you let the industry heal. Because actually, one bad actor or a few bad actors does not represent our industry. We're not here because of what he did. We're here because we're helping people, financial inclusion, digital property rights, great games we're building, better entertainment, a better internet, right? A better future is what we're here for, right? But the world is now talking about that, and I think it's time we sort of hit the delete button on SPF and move on, and celebrate and take the opportunity to celebrate all of the most important things that we do. Like, for instance, most recently we sold NFTs and gave teachers literally a year's worth of their salary in some of these sales. Or the kind of magic that Axie Infinity has done in places like the Philippines, for instance. Those are the victories we should be talking about. And I think I'll close it with a quote I just heard from someone at Brink, James. He said, "We need to hard fork from the bad actors." So thank you.
Thank you. Well, life is so full of ironies. Someone who was touted to be the next JP Morgan, well, we don't know if that was the case, but it certainly turned out to be the next Lehman. But on a very positive and hopeful note, winters are when you put your head down and build. Decentralization and democratization has been proven to be good for societies, for individuals, and let's continue to do that. Let's weed out the bad actors and let's focus on what we can build. So please give a very warm round of applause for Yat.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that conversation.
Thank you so much, Malik Khan Kataria and Yat Siu. Before we move on to our next batch of discussions, it's time to take another break. You may take your lunch and come back after 40 minutes. And while waiting for our program to start, please feel free to take some photos and tweet like crazy using our